Greg's chapter titles may be getting better, slightly, but his arguments is definitely getting worse. In fact, in today's chapter, I don't think he gets a single one right. Hey there, folks. Bertram, the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. Last time we finished up chapter 11, which puts us at a little more than halfway through the book. So we's making good progress. And this brings us to chapter 12, entitled Sibling Rivalry and Infanticide. So congratulations to Greg, I guess, for finally resisting the temptation to use the word suicide somewhere in the title. Like the previous two chapters, this one's about self-defeating arguments, or at least arguments that Greg thinks is self-defeating. But as we've already seen, sometimes he's a little quick to jump to that conclusion, and today ain't going to be no different. So let's go ahead on in and start off with what Greg calls sibling rivalry. Quote, occasionally in conversations you will notice something odd. You will hear a pair of objections voiced by the same person, but the complaints are logically inconsistent with each other. They are like children fighting between themselves, siblings in rivalry. End quote. And for his first example of sibling rivalry, he's going to share a story he heard from a Christian apologist in India named Prakash. Quote, is Gandhi in heaven? The Hindu asked. Heaven would be a very poor place without Gandhi in it. Well, sir, Prakash answered, you must at least believe in heaven then. What kind of people go to heaven? Good people go to heaven, he responded. End quote. Greg says that this is a good example of someone using his Columbo tactic, and I agree. Prakash is asked a simple, direct question about what he believes, and he manipulates the conversation to avoid answering the question. Not only that, but he's twisting what the Hindu said. The Hindu didn't say he believed in heaven personally, he just asked a question about what Christians believe. But Prakash turned that into the Hindu believing in heaven, and that's going to come up later on. So the Hindu says good people go to heaven, but where did he get that idea? That ain't a Hindu idea, so he must have got it from Christians or from the Bible. For example, in Matthew 25 and verses 31 and following, Jesus says that at the last judgment, he's going to separate the good people from the bad ones, like a shepherd separating the sheep from the goats, and he's going to put the sheep on his right. Quote, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. End quote. So Jesus is very clearly stating that good folks is going to go to heaven on account of their good works, like feeding the hungry and showing hospitality to strangers and such. But that's a problem, because conservative evangelical believers today don't actually believe what Jesus said. See, after Jesus was crucified, Peter come up with the notion that his death must have been some kind of sacrifice for sin. And not just any sacrifice, it had to be the ultimate sacrifice that pays for all sins. Then Paul come along and added the idea that believers is saved by faith, apart from good works, and then Luther came along and added the idea that salvation was by faith alone. So we've got two conflicting notions in the Bible. We got what Jesus originally taught, and then we got what the apostles taught, as interpreted a millennium or so later by the Protestants. But it don't end there, because in Ephesians 1, verses 4 and 5, Paul says, quote, he chose us in him before the foundation of the world that we should be holy and blameless before him. In love he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ according to the purpose of his will. End quote. So now we got a third sibling conflicting with the other two and saying that folks go to heaven because they was predestined to go there. So I think it's understandable that the Hindu might have some questions about what Christians really believe about who goes to heaven and why. But saying that good people go to heaven is at least consistent with what Jesus said, so we'll give the Hindu credit for that. Prakash, on the other hand, he's determined to pull some shenanigans, so he pretends he don't know what the phrase good people means. Quote, but this idea of what is a good person is very unclear to me. What is good? In typical Hindu fashion, he replied, good and bad are relative. There's no clear definition. If that is true, sir, that goodness is relative and can't be defined, how is it that you assume Gandhi is good and should be in heaven? End quote. Or at least that's what Greg says is how Prakash told him the conversation went. But I'm going to go ahead and press X to doubt here. We all know how apologists likes to revise conversations to better suit their narrative, and I has a suspicion that the Hindu didn't really say that the term good can't be defined. I think the Hindu probably had some definitions that Prakash didn't like, and he's just summarizing all of them by saying that the Hindu didn't have any, meaning any that Prakash personally approved of. But notice what Prakash is doing here. He's asking for the Hindu's definition of good, so of course the Hindu is given a Hindu definition, not a Christian definition. Greg wants to use this as an example of a person holding conflicting beliefs, but this ain't that. At best, the Hindu's belief about goodness ain't compatible with Christian beliefs about heaven, but the Hindu ain't a Christian, so this ain't an internal conflict in the Hindu's beliefs, it's a conflict between Hinduism and Christianity. The only real conflict here is between the various different Christian notions of who gets to heaven and how they gets there. Greg closes this section with a non sequitur. Quote, either Gandhi fulfills some external standard of goodness, thus qualifying for heaven, or goodness is relative and therefore a meaningless term when applied to anyone, including Gandhi. End quote. This is false. When two baseball teams compete to see who's going to go to the playoffs, there ain't no fixed number of points that's defined as being the winning score. It's relative. The winning score is defined as being the score that's greater than the other team's score. Being relative don't mean it can't be defined, it just means it's a relative standard, and that's perfectly valid. Greg makes a similar mistake when talking to a college student in India who asked him how God could allow suffering if he was the kind of God that Greg was preaching. And right away, Greg displays his mastery of international diplomacy by telling the student, whose name was Kativa, that the suffering in India was not God's fault, it was Hinduism's fault. You know, as if an all-wise, all-knowing, and all-powerful God couldn't do nothing about that. Brilliant. He next promises her pie in the sky by declaring that one day Jesus would eliminate all evil from the earth, which prompts Kativa to ask, quote, how could that be, she objected. Evil and good exist as dual poles. If you have no evil, it is impossible to have good. Each must balance the other out. End quote. And notice, she's given a Hindu perspective here, but it's one I've heard Christian apologists use quite a bit in trying to address the problem of evil. It's the old line about how we couldn't know what light is if there weren't no darkness. And I'd say it's a fair bet that if Kativa had phrased her question a little bit differently, in a slightly different context, Greg himself might have made this same argument to her. So it's really a conflict in his own position, but he's going to try and make it look like an internal contradiction in Kativa's belief system. Quote, I noticed immediately that Kativa's response was at odds with her first question. Let me repeat this reasoning back to you, I said, and you tell me what you think of it. You ask, why are innocent children starving in the streets? I answer, good and evil exist as dual poles. Children starve in Madras, so kids in other parts of the world may be happy and well. The one balances the other out. What do you think? End quote. Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think Greg has completely failed to answer Kativa's question. He repeated back to her how Hinduism accounts for evil. But that ain't inconsistent with Hinduism, and it ain't got nothing to do with what she was asking. She was asking how a Christian God could condone such evil if and he was really so powerful and so good. And Greg danced around and never really answered. He just pointed out how Hinduism was compatible with her Hindu beliefs. Well done, Greg. Greg goes on to discuss some of the comments he heard after a film about the Holocaust, about why God would allow the Holocaust to happen to folks that were supposedly his chosen people. And one person suggested that perhaps the Holocaust was God's judgment on the Jews for becoming too secular, which prompted another person to sarcastically say, well, that's a real loving God. And Greg's response was this, quote, those who are quick to object that God isn't doing enough about evil in the world, a good God wouldn't let that happen, are often equally quick to complain when God puts his foot down. A loving God would never deliver judgment. If God appears indifferent to wickedness, his goodness is challenged. Yet if he acts to punish sin, his love is in question. End quote. Greg tries to make out that this is some kind of internal conflict, but it ain't. It's always better to prevent evil than to respond to evil with more evil. So it's legitimate both to call out God's failure to prevent evil and to call out the evil that is said to be his divine punishment, especially in cases like the Holocaust that inflict horrific suffering on the young and old and innocent and guilty alike. And remember, God ain't sitting here. We ain't holding a court trial with God sitting in the defendant's seat. We got no actual God to complain about. We're just talking about what men claim about God. And what men claim about God is full of inconsistencies and post hoc rationalizations that deserve to be questioned. What we see is a real world in which the expected manifestations of a loving God is absent, with believers making unfounded and inconsistent claims about what he supposedly is or is not invisibly doing behind the scenes. And we's within our rights to challenge that. Greg next has a long section in which he tries to make an internal conflict out of what he calls moral relativism. According to Greg, there's only two possibilities. Either God defines what's good and evil, or else good and evil is just subjective personal preferences that nobody has any right to impose on anybody else. But that, of course, is a false dichotomy. Good and bad is like good health and bad health. We've all had the experience of being free from illness and injury, and we've all had the experience of suffering from illness and or injury, and with very few exceptions, we all prefer to be free from illness and injury. At the individual level, that's a subjective personal preference, but the fact that it's common experience to all of us gives us a basis for a social consensus that says being free from illness and injury is good health, and suffering from them is bad health. And the presence or absence of illness and injury is an objective standard. They's either objectively present or objectively absent. So we got a social consensus based on both subjective preference and objective criteria. And that's true for good and bad in general. Our attitudes and actions has objective consequences that impact other folks in ways that they has subjective opinions about. And being as we's all material critters, we're going to have a lot in common when it comes to how we feel about these consequences. And that gives us an objective basis for having a social consensus that defines for us what's good and what's bad, with or without any gods. Greg's last example of supposed sibling rivalry tries to tackle the subject of homosexuality, about which Greg has some serious confusion. Quote, if homosexuality is morally neutral because it's natural, then adoption by same-sex couples must be wrong because for homosexuals, parenthood would be unnatural by the same standard. If nature dictates morality and the natural consequence for homosexuals is to be childless, then it's unnatural and therefore immoral for homosexuals to raise children. End quote. And this is the kind of garbled nonsense that appeals to homophobes because it tries to turn the tables on those who defend the human rights of gay folks. Let's start with that first if. Nobody is saying that homosexuality is morally neutral because it's natural. What's happening here is that homophobes is attacking gay folks by claiming that homosexuality is unnatural somehow, and then getting all embarrassed and paranoid whenever anybody points out that they ain't nothing unnatural about it at all. So to get around that, they makes up a straw man to say that homosexuality is okay because it's natural. And that ain't the case. Homosexuality ain't just morally neutral, it's morally good because it promotes committed, healthy, mutually supportive relationships between consenting adults. And them kind of relationships create stability and prosperity in a healthy society. It also happens to be perfectly natural, but that's beside the point. The point is that it promotes healthy relationships that's beneficial to society. Greg's next confusion is about the difference between procreation and childcare. Them as separate things, and it's perfectly natural in any social species for adults to provide a greater or lesser degree of care for the young'uns, regardless of whose uterus developed them. They ain't nothing remotely unnatural or even unusual about adults caring for youngsters that they personally did not give birth to. And even if it was, in some sense, not natural, that wouldn't mean that there's anything immoral about it. Heck, wearing clothes is unnatural in the sense that we don't find it in nature. I don't mean it's wrong. So Greg ain't finding any internal inconsistencies among gay folks and their allies. He's only giving vent to his own irrational hatred. Greg's last category of internal conflicts is a conflict that he calls infanticide, by which he means a statement that pulls the rug out from under itself. An example would be if you sent me a letter and at the end of the letter you said, "Please let me know if you don't get this letter." Well, the only way I can know you want me to let you know I didn't get it is if I did get it. So that's a non-starter. Greg's first real example of this kind of conflict has to do with, surprise, surprise, the problem of evil. And an even bigger surprise, he's going to mention moral objectivists, folks who believe in objective good and evil, but without God. Quote, "When moral objectivists argue that God cannot exist because of evil, their view fails in a different way. It commits infanticide." End quote. And to explain what he means by this, he uses the example of bowling. Quote, "I want you to think about the concepts of good and bad for a moment. How do you know the difference between, say, a good bowler and a bad one? Knowing the difference between mediocre and masterful in anything requires a way of keeping score. There must be some standard of perfection for you to measure a performance. In bowling, that standard is 300. End quote. So this is a classic example of picking your premises specifically so you can arrive at a predetermined conclusion. Greg wants to argue that you have to have a perfect standard before you can judge whether anything is good or bad, and of course only God can provide a perfect standard, and blah, blah, blah. But he's starting from a false premise. It ain't true that a perfect standard is required in order to recognize what's better and what's worse. Bowling happens to have a perfect score, so he's using bowling as his example. But what about soccer? There's no maximum perfect number of points you can score. You just keep racking up goals as often as you can. Or take music, for example. What makes one musician a good musician and another one better? There's no score keeping at all. Yet some musicians is definitely better or worse than others. Now, even if you say, well, the perfect standard is you don't make no mistakes while performing, there's still some musicians who can perform without any mistakes and still not be as good as other musicians, even if the other ones do make mistakes. So right off the bat, Greg's building on a false premise, and he follows that up with a false insight. Quote, "Here's an insight that helps. A moral rule entails a command along with a duty to obey it. Both require minds. Ethicist Richard Taylor explains, a duty is something that is owed, but something can only be owed to some person or persons. The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God." End quote. And that might be true if there was no such thing as people, but that ain't the case. Duty is something that's owed to some person or persons, and hey, that's us. You don't need to invent some kind of invisible mythical deity just to have someone to owe your social obligations to. Society is already here. And what's the objective standard for good and bad? Well, the objective material consequences of our actions. Bad things is bad because of the harmful consequences they inflict on others. And anybody who advocates bad behavior is going to find society working against them. They have a social duty to behave morally, and society is going to impose penalties for immoral behavior. And that's morality. Nothing more, nothing less. Greg is arguing from a false premise to a predetermined conclusion, but meanwhile in the real world, morality exists without and maybe even in spite of the Christian God. Next up, Greg tackles what he calls Scientism, which he defines as the belief that science is the only reliable source of truth. In other words, it is at best a gross oversimplification, and at worst a straw man used by apologists to try and score some points against actual science. And he just rehashes the same argument he made before about how you supposedly can't use science to show that science is the only reliable source for truth. Which is fine, only folks don't actually believe that. They don't discard math and logic and personal experience just so they can say science is the only source of truth. What we say is that science has repeatedly, historically, and undeniably demonstrated itself to be the most reliable way to discover truth about observable reality. And Greg can't honestly dispute that, which is why he'd rather go punching his little straw man. And for his last example, he takes on determinism. Quote, determinists claim that freedom is an illusion. Each of our choices is fixed, strictly determined beforehand by the circumstances that precede it. All of our choices are inevitable results of blind physical forces beyond our control. The problem with this view is that without freedom, rationality would have no room to operate. Arguments would not matter since no one would be able to base beliefs on adequate reasons. One would hold beliefs only because he had been predetermined to do so. End quote. Now, the irony here is that in order for beliefs to be based on adequate reasons, those reasons must determine those beliefs. In attempting to invoke infanticide against determinism, Greg commits infanticide against his own case. It is the deterministic nature of logic and reason that make rationality possible. All this hand-waving about quote-unquote freedom is mere emotionalism. Greg don't like the fact that we's material beings built out of material components running material processes, and so, like so many before him, he holds up so-called freedom like it was some kind of banner. And Greg himself even admits it. Quote, although it is theoretically possible that determinism is true, there's no internal contradiction as far as I can tell. No one could ever know if it were. Every one of our thoughts, dispositions, and opinions would have been decided for us by factors out of our control. End quote. And that's backwards. Knowledge only exists when the content of our beliefs is determined by external facts. If in our beliefs was just some spontaneous random notion that we arrived at for no good reason, that wouldn't be knowledge, that'd be hallucination. Determinism is what makes it possible for us to give reasons for why we believe what we do and for us to show how we can know what we know. So it ain't that determinism is wrong per se, it's just that Greg don't like it. But that's too bad because without determinism there would be no logic, no physical laws, nothing but pure, truly random chaos. And that would be a bad thing. And that's basically it for Chapter 12. Greg tried to show how objections to Christianity fail through some kind of internal conflict, and I don't think he got even one of them right, apart from the straw man. And that's pretty close to a perfect score, which makes Greg's arguments objectively bad, at least according to his reasoning. And I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but that's going to do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to take up Chapter 13, entitled, quote, Taking the Roof Off, end quote. At a quick glance, it looks like he's talking about taking the other person's position to a ridiculous extreme, which might be Greg's forte. So we'll definitely have to check that out. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.